All right. Hey, Brandon, we're live.
Great. Good to be here.
All right. Here we go. Part 2, right? I guess.
Yeah, number 2 out of, I don't know, 3 or 4 at least. We'll keep going, though.
Yeah, you're a little dark. There you go. That's much better. People can start to see your face. So we're doing something a little bit different today, and I'm going to be posting a link for everybody to see, and it's going to be the first comment on here. So go ahead and make sure that you go ahead and you grab this bit.ly link, and it's going to take you to a Google Doc, which will take you to some slides that we're going to kind of walk you through, okay? And what we're going to be doing here is walking you guys through some stuff that we're doing, and you'll feel like things are going to be a lot better if you actually take the time and you go to the link. So remember, we're looking for your feedback. We're looking for your interaction. We're looking for your comments. So this is what we would like you to do. Inside the comments, go ahead and let us know once you've gotten to the link and that you've got the content that we're sharing. And once we see that, we will be all set to go. We're going to walk you through these slides. We haven't really figured out how to do the Facebook Live where we can do a screen share. So bear with us as we kind of get through here. Now, you guys blew things away in our last live, so we're going to have to set some new rules, some new contests. First, if you stick around to the end, we're going to give away 6 months of our PPC software. Second, if you comment or like the video and we get over 100 comments, then we're going to start giving away some t-shirts. All right. So if you want to give some t-shirts, start hitting your little like button, show us some love, start hitting your heart button, start giving us some laughs. That's what we want to see. All right. So I see you guys are in there. You're grabbing the Google Doc, and that's great. And yeah, I see some love being shared and some likes being shared. That's what I love to see. Thank you, guys. We want this to be interactive. We want to hear your questions. We're going to get into some deep dive here into how auto, broad, exact, phrase all work. Brandon's put together some slides to kind of give us some walkthrough. So if you get a little lost, stop us and ask some questions. All right, Brandon, you want to get it started?
Yeah, sorry, the screen share thing doesn't work, so we're just gonna do this kind of interactively. So kind of like I don't know, you guys are probably not old enough to remember back when you used to push. You'd hear a ding and it was like push ding, and then you'd flip the page. That was like when I was a child, but sort of like that, going back in time. So we promised everybody today we're going to be talking about keyword match types. This is kind of the next. So last time we talked about just some basic terminology. We talked about what certain terms mean and everything. So today we're going to go expand upon that. We're going to talk more about keyword match types specifically. So this is actually a little bit of, we can go a little bit deep here because there is quite a bit to it. But so building on what we talked about last time, we're going to start talking about match types. I think last time we talked about automatic and manual campaigns. Let's start diving into that a little bit more. So
yeah, so before we do, let's see. How many people here, give us a yes if you are currently running an auto-targeted campaign on sponsored product ads. If you're not, then tell us no. We want to kind of give a general sense of who's running auto-targeted campaigns, who's not running auto-targeted campaigns. All right, we got some yeses coming through. What's up, Jeff? What's up back to you? All right.
I don't think I've seen any no's yet. Everybody's saying yes. Oh, there's a couple no's.
A couple not yets. Very soon. Great. Well, this is something that was very eye-opening for me when we started digging into this and really understanding what does an auto-targeted campaign mean and how do we actually use the information. So go for it, Brandon. Start explaining.
Yeah, so like the slide says, an automatic targeted campaign, what basically means we want to trust Amazon to pick our keywords for us. So Amazon's got a lot of data. They know what keywords our product ranks for. They know what content we have in our listing. They have all kinds of stuff to do that. I actually had a misspelling on here before, and somebody corrected me, but they have this image recognition system called Recognition, spelled with a K. And so they have all these technologies that they may or may not be using to figure out what kind of keywords your product ranks for. And they use a whole bunch of stuff to try and figure that out. So over on the right side of this slide, you'll see I've got about 20 different sort of keywords listed over here. This is for the Apple Slicer campaign that we use is a lot of examples. But you can see there's a couple terms over here like Apple Peeler and Apple Slicer that might apply to that. Apple Peeler Slicer Core is one of those. But most of the terms over there are actually not very specific. Like I've got some brand names like Pampered Chef. I've got mandolin slicers. I've got potato peelers. I've got a whole bunch of keywords over there that Amazon is spending my money on in its automatic targeted campaigns, but they may or may not be relevant to my product. So Amazon uses all this data they have from your keyword listing to your competitors' products, all that kind of stuff. They've got some magic algorithm where they pull it together. For some people, it works pretty well. For some people, it doesn't work very well at all. But we see plenty of campaigns that have really good ACOS goals, really good ACOS on the overall campaign. So it does work for some people. The problem, like I mentioned, is like you're spending money a lot of times advertising on these terms that are not very useful or not very relevant to your product. So.
Yeah, and hey, Brandon, can you explain what the ASINs are that are in that list?
Oh, yeah. So I left a couple of ASINs in here. You'll see all these that start with the B0. These are ASINs. They're other products. They're ASINs of other products. And what happens when those show up in your automatic targeting reports basically means that your product is your ad is being shown on other people's or other products' product detail pages. So if you ever go to a product detail page, you scroll down a ways and you see sponsored products related to this product. That means your ad was shown on one of those, and this is the ASIN of the product on which your product was shown. So there's a lot of times, especially for really new products that don't have a lot of keyword history or anything, we see like 50-60% of the terms that they're being bid on or spent money on are actually competitor ASINs and not necessarily keywords at all.
All right, hey Larry, let me just kind of remind you, we're on this Google Doc. We're on slide 2. We're kind of doing a little hybrid of Facebook Live and some sharing since we couldn't do a video share. So if you click the link that I just sent you, we're on slide number 2. We're talking about auto-targeting. And typically the way people are okay, so Damien says, I don't understand, why does it show an ASIN? So the reason why, when you see an ASIN, that means that your ad is showing up on somebody else's website, their product detail page, as opposed to a search results page. So when you see an ASIN, that means that you're showing up on somebody else's product detail page. And since you're not actually showing up for a search term, you're actually showing up for you're showing up for their product detail page, and they've connected your product and their product together in some way.
Exactly. So like I said, on really new products, you tend to see more and more of those ASINs because you don't have Amazon doesn't have a lot of history on those. And after your product's got a lot more history, we tend to see like fewer of those ASINs being in the reports. So
yeah, so it looks like that kind of helped explain. Let's see. So Neer says, so what can you do anything with these, Brandon? Can you negative keyword these? Can you actually run ads against these or anything like that?
Yeah, so we can't add. So you'll see performance on those, right? So you'll see the number of impressions, clicks, your conversion rate, your ACOS on all those. The only thing you can do on those ASINs is set them as campaign negative keywords, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But they're mostly there for reporting ability. That's how Amazon calculated it or accounted for it when your ad was shown. But the only ability you have to like control those are to set them as negative keywords. You can't bid on them, and you can't bid on them specifically, and you can only make them into campaign negative keywords to stop bidding on those. There might be some interesting insights actually you can gain out of that. If you go to that products page, you can see what products you're being advertised on, and maybe if you have good conversion rates from that or good ACOS goals from that, you can figure out what keywords they're using, maybe take a look at their images and mimic what they're doing. They're getting some of the traffic and ultimately buying your product, so you got to figure out what that means for your product. But there may be some content you can figure out how to work into your own page from those.
Yeah, and there's when you're looking at the auto-targeted campaigns, you're trying to collect information. A lot of people will discuss this as kind of the information finding stage for sponsored product ads. This is where you're really just kind of trying to figure out which field to play in. And that's why you're going to start seeing things all over the place, because Amazon, not Google, Amazon is going to try your ad in as many places as they can put it, because they want to make the most broad, in the most broad sense, they want to try your ad. And if your ad starts to generate clicks, and remember last week we talked about impressions and clicks and click-through ratios and some of those different definitions. Every time your ad is shown, that's an impression. Whenever you generate a click, that's telling Amazon that the ad may be relevant for the term. And then when a conversion occurs, that's telling Amazon that it was a correct association between a term and a click and a buy. And so Amazon wants to give you as many clicks as they can, because guess what? They make money. That's right. They make money. And so therefore they want to show your ad in as many places as they can get it. Auto-targeting campaign is going to be the most broad for your product, which is why you get all these random things like a pie carrier. What's a pie carrier have to do with an apple slicer?
Well, you might make apple pie with your apple pie slicer, and then you need a pie carrier to carry it with. Right.
So German brings up a good point. He says, just to be clear, you cannot use ASINs on manual campaigns.
That's true.
He's correct. They're only available in the auto-targeting.
Yep, and it's mostly just a reporting feature. You can't target them. You can't pick them out. Like I said, the only thing you can do is set them as negatives if they're performing poorly, which is one of the downsides of an automatic targeted campaign, right? So I put on here, automatic targeted campaigns are easy to create, but they often lead you to some of the stuff but you can't have a lot of control over. So I don't want to jump right over to some of the manual targeted stuff because we're spent quite a bit of time on that, but. Let's go over to the next slide now. It talks about, so going to slide 3, it talks about exact match.
Yeah, so, and Nir, we're going to come back to your question here in a minute, which is a really good question. And we're going to come back to that here in a minute, but let's get through the definitions before we jump into that.
Yeah, so exact match is when you're starting a manual targeted campaign now, you have the ability to create different keywords in there. And for each keyword, you can specify what kind of match type you want on it. You can specify either an exact match, a phrase match, or a broad match. And so when we're talking exact match, I like to the better term for it might be a very close match because it's not actually exact. Amazon does include like plurals and misspellings and some other filler words in there like prepositions, a and the, he and she sometimes. So an exact match is generally pretty exact. Apple slicer and apple slicers. And some misspellings like we have on the screen there. So most of those are pretty exact, but it does include some variations.
Yeah, and so, Brandon, let's just talk about really quickly, because we kind of jumped it. Why would you move from the auto-targeted campaign to the manual campaign?
Well, most of the ability is the ability to have much finer grain control. So that's the easy way to explain it is you get a lot more. On the automatic targeted campaign, you have very little control in place. It's one bid for everything, and all you can do is set up some negative keywords. On the manual targeted campaign, you have much, much greater ability to control both the keywords you're bidding on, the bids for those keywords, and everything related to those.
Right. And so essentially what you're doing is at the beginning, you're going to this auto-targeted campaign, and you're giving Amazon a budget, and Amazon's going to find as many keywords as they can find, and start generating ads for you. And then your job as a responsible seller and business owner is to start moving those over into manual campaigns. And as Brandon's explaining now, there's 3 types of manual campaigns, 3 types of match types within a manual campaign: the exact, the phrase, and the broad. And that's what we're trying to kind of cover now. And so let's see, how quickly do you usually switch? That's a really good question, Brandon. How quickly will you switch from an auto to a manual campaign?
Mostly it depends on how much you're willing to spend and how many clicks, however you want to measure that. So there's different opinions on how you want to do that. I tend to think like the more data you get, the better. But also I would love to see hundreds or 200 clicks. But obviously, in all times, that would cost you way too much money or take way too long to get to that point. So most people are making decisions on sometimes as low as 1 or 2 clicks, sometimes 5 or 10. It really depends on each key phrase.
Yeah,
I don't. Yeah, there's a little bit. I think we need to understand a little bit more about all these different things before we start making sort of suggestions about how to use them.
Right. And Nir said, 10 days. Brandon and I are very cautious not to put days, but actually to use numbers for making your decision. Because if you have something within 2 days that performs really well, you can move it right then and there. So typically it's said that you should give yourself 5, 7, 10 days to collect a bunch of information. But what you really want to do is set parameters for what defines success. And what Brandon was saying is that when you look at this from a very statistical standpoint, the more data you get, the more statistically accurate you get in the decision that you're making. And so if you're doing something based off of 1 or 2 clicks, your statistical accuracy of that is very low. If you do something off of like 50 to 100 clicks, your statistical accuracy is very high. And I know that that's kind of very geeky, but it's the way we try to think of things. And now we're trying to, find ways to explain it to you in a sense that doesn't require so much programmable conversation.
Yeah. One more thing I want to touch on here, and looking at the slide, it helps to explain that. But there's a very subtle difference between what a keyword is and what a user actually searches. So we're trying to use the term keyword in coordination. We're talking about a keyword. We're talking about a keyword that we set up inside a campaign. And every keyword is always associated with a match type. So whenever I talk about a keyword, I'm going to talk about it in the terms of the keyword and the match type being either broad, phrase, or exact. And then every keyword that we have is going to match to many different user search terms, right? So even the exact match that we have on the screen for the term apple slicer, I've got 5 different examples of customer search terms that are actually going to match up to that one keyword. And there's a very subtle difference between a keyword and a user search term that it's kind of important to understand that. So when we're talking about automatic targeted campaigns, we're really getting user search terms out of that report. We're not getting keywords necessarily out of that. So we have to figure out how to group those together into keywords that might make sense.
So Brandon, question just came up. How many ASINs do you put into an ad group?
Wow, now we're jumping all over the place. So I would say you want to have campaigns that have a bunch of products in them that are very similar, that have similar keywords.
So a bunch is not necessary. It could be one, but the similarity of the products is more important.
Depending on what your budget model is, that's going to be dependent on like how much time you want to spend managing your campaigns, how granular you want to be. So you want to be fairly. For most of our sellers, if you're doing like private label and stuff, I would say 1 parent ASIN per campaign is probably the best route to go. If you want to, there's plenty of reason to make exceptions to that. If you have different clothing and shoes and some of that stuff, there's really good reasons in those to group many products together. But there's campaign organization we're going to talk about, I think, in our next presentation. So
yeah, we're going to really dive deep into campaign organization. So right now, let's keep moving through kind of. Through this, and we're just talked about exact match, and exact match being the closest match you get to a term, and the variables of exact match are only going to really be prepositions, misspellings, and plurals, right? So exactly. Let's move on to phrase match.
Okay, cool. So we're going to go over to slide 4. It's talking about phrase matches, and again, we're using this example of an apple slicer throughout here. So phrase match basically means that the words apple slicer must be next to each other, but they can have other words before or after them. So this is actually pulled from one of our live campaigns we're running. You'll see the term apple slicer. If we have a phrase match keyword for the term apple slicer, we still might see user search terms that appear in that include apple slicer, which would also show up under the exact match. But we get all these other terms like 12-piece apple slicer and OXO apple slicer and large apple slicer and red apple slicer and a lot of branded terms in here. But these are all, you'll notice every one of them has the term apple slicer next to each other. That's really what defines a phrase match, is that apple slicer, guys, it has to be next to each other. Now, we actually find examples where I could have apples slicer. So they do use actually misspellings and plurals of each of the individual words. I don't think there's any in this example that I pulled off of here, but if I had apple slicers, that would still count or still match up to the phrase match type. But the term apple slicer has to be next to each other. If you had a 3-word one, if I had red apple slicer would have to appear together all together. And then I could still have words before or after it. And then I could have some common misspellings in between there and a few of those prepositions in between. But for the most part, it's apple slicer together. That's a phrase match. And we find these are really, really useful because these are pretty targeted, but they're still pretty focused on what we're talking about. So these are actually, a lot of times you don't need to go all the way down to exact match. We're going to talk about this a little bit deeper later. But sometimes a phrase match is great. You have enough data at a phrase match level to be very effective. Anything else you want to say about phrase matches there, Jeff?
No, but I love the comments that are coming through. I love the hearts and the love. And if you want to share this, we'd love for you to click on the little button and share. We'd love for you to share this with other people. Let's look through the questions here. How should we think about adding negative keywords?
I'm going to touch on that in just a couple minutes if you don't mind.
All right, awesome.
For a minute.
And then is there a particular way that a keyword, so if a keyword is moving from auto-targeted to exact to phrase to broad, do you want to go, how do you know whether to make it exact, broad, or phrase? Or should we cover all of them and kind of do that?
Can we just let's get through broad and then and talk about those a little bit in some detail there?
All right, cool. So let's move on to the broad, and then we'll kind of move on to kind of answering questions and covering everything from the high level. Okay,
so now on to slide 5 is the broad match. So that one, as you might imagine, is more broad. So again, with our example of apple slicer, you'll see the examples here. All these user search terms are going to contain the word apple and they're going to contain the word slicer, but they might be in different orders. They again might be plurals or misspellings of those. But I've got some really good examples over here, I think. So apple slicer, that term would still be matched up to a broad match for the word apple slicer. Also, like a green apple slicer, which is going to match exact. If I use the same term, it could match down to the broad match, the phrase match of green apple slicer. But then we've got apple slicer good quality. We've got red slicer for apple. We've got slicer for red apples. And we've got slice case for Apple iPhone S6. So these are all terms that would match the broad term apple slicer. And obviously that last one I threw in there it still contains the word apple and slice, which is like a variation of slicer. And this would be one that was not very relevant to us, obviously, because that's talking about a completely different product. So as we get more broad as we go from phrase to broad specifically, you tend to get more things in there that are outside of what you actually intend. And so as the name implies, broad is more broad. And so you'll often find that there's really easy opportunities to find stuff in there and to set those as negative keywords. For example, if I was running this campaign with the broad term apple slicer and I found like slice case for Apple iPhone S6s, that would be one I'd set as a negative campaign keyword really quickly because that doesn't have anything to do with my product, which we might be spending money on, but is obviously not going to perform very well.
Yeah, and that's really that's where we're going to get into negative keywords. And typically when you're looking at this from a campaign structure, which we're going to get into campaign structure next week, you want your highest bid. So the most you're going to pay for a term, you want to pay for an exact, and then you want to pay less for a phrase and less for a broad, and the very least for auto-targeted.
That's generally true, but there's going to be exceptions to that, I think, all over the place too. So
yeah. And this is where Brandon and I actually debate, because I go, well, Brandon, we need to teach people kind of really basic way to do it, and then let people make their own determination about how to make and sophisticate their campaign. Because, if I was to ask you guys on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your skill for sponsored product ads? So 1 is I've never done it before. 10 is I consider myself an expert. So give us a sense. How would you rate your skills for sponsored product ads? Do you consider yourself an expert, which is a 10, never started before, which is a 1, or are you somewhere in between? So give us a sense of kind of where you're at so we can kind of gear our conversations back to you, and get a good sense of kind of what you're where your learning is at. So a lot of I gotta go to 11. All right,
Kristen.
So Kristen thinks she's an expert. Lots of 1s and 2s. Lots of people under kind of 5 and below. Appreciate you guys sharing your honesty with us, because we've been playing with sponsored product ads for quite a while here, and I don't know that we would consider ourselves a 10 for what we do, but we definitely have learned quite a lot about it, and there is a lot to understand. And when you're dealing with everything in your business and you're also dealing with trying to learn all these marketing channels, it can be really, really cumbersome. And I think the one thing that that we're hearing and that we're seeing more and more is that if you don't understand sponsored product ads, then you're really missing out on an opportunity to drive sales for your business. And so this is something that sellers have to spend time on. And this applies to you whether you're doing private label, whether you're doing wholesale, because if you're doing something where you're fighting for the buy box, your ad only shows up when you have the buy box. So you can't say, oh, I don't need to worry about this because, I'm selling somebody else's product. All right. So a couple people are still asking for the slides. So I'll post the link one more time.
I just keep posting that every 5
minutes. Through the comments, they're in here. David, we love you as well. And so thank you for loving Feedback Genius. You can go ahead, throw some hearts up for us. And you know what, Brandon? I think before we move into questions, let's give away some T-shirts. Who wants a T-shirt?
Way to go. T-shirt time.
Who wants a T-shirt? You have to comment if you want a T-shirt. You have to comment. So if you have not commented and you want a T-shirt, then you better comment, because I'm going to give away some T-shirts right now.
Do all those hearts and smiley faces count as comments? I see a lot of them, but I don't think those count for you, right?
They don't count for comments. No, we're giving this away based on comments. The hearts and smiley faces just show your love. All right, I'm going to do a random picker. That's the best way to do it. Is just an online random picker.
So I think the way you do this is you'll pick out a random one, right, and then you'll notify whoever it was after the fact. After we look back through the comments.
Yep. And then so comment number 120. Oh, I better get a pen and paper. I got to write this stuff down.
Now, this is recorded for posterity.
I'm going to put it in the comments.
Number 120. We'll remember that.
Comment number 135. Oh, they're all high now, huh? It's totally random. One more. Get your comments in. We've got more to give you guys, so we're not done yet. We're just kind of taking a little bit of a break, okay? And number 5, comment number 5. Okay, those are going to be our winners. I will reach out to you. You guys just want free T-shirts.
No whammies. All right.
All right. And so let's kind of move on here and see. Were there any other questions that came in, Brandon, that you wanted to cover?
I don't know. It's so filled up with hearts and everything. I can't tell now if there's any questions. I'm scrolling back a little bit.
Does anyone have a massive confusion between auto, broad, exact, and phrase? Is there any more questions kind of before we jump into that as to, what else we can explain to you on that before we kind of jump into this? I'm just looking back for our otherwise we're going to get into negative keywords.
I think hopefully that explanation we've had in there is pretty good. I think the simple explanation of the words together, the words not together, or the words exactly is basically the quick explanation of those.
Brandon, in all honesty, if you look at the slides, the examples on the slides are what really make the difference. And so look at the examples and understand how Amazon looks at each of those so you guys can figure out exactly how it's done. Because once I saw the examples on paper, it made a lot more sense to me.
Yep, and why don't we? I think we have some people working on this, but we're going to put together like a PDF or a graphic or something that has those in more of a shareable sort of permanent format, right?
Yes.
We're working on
all right. So we have one question here. It says, "Would you enter the whole phrase for the case as an exact match negative, or just the word case as the negative?"
So it looks like that was from Kimmery, right? So that
was your question on the cell phone case. Would you just enter the word slice for apple, or would you enter that whole phrase as a negative? And that's a good transition into negative keywords, which is slide 7.
Yeah, actually, that's the really good transition. So actually, in that example, I'd probably set the word, instead of the word case, I'd probably set the word iPhone as a negative, because you're going to have a lot. Perhaps somebody wants a apple slicer that has a case on it. I don't know. And these are just obviously like little contrived examples, but in that example, I might use the word iPhone as a better negative keyword, because obviously my product doesn't have anything to do with an iPhone. Presumably it might have something to do with the case. I don't know. So that's a really good example. Good question there.
All right. Yeah. So let's kind of just jump into slide number 7 here, negative keywords, and how you would use negative keywords, because you can use negative keywords in all 4 of these campaign types, right?
You can't. It doesn't really make any sense in an exact campaign. So I'd say there's no purpose of making a negative exact inside of an exact against an exact match keyword, right? So if I'm bidding on the term apple slicer, I don't want to make a negative search keyword for apple slicer. Kind of defeats the whole purpose of it. So, but yeah, and so the example we have on the screen there, we're on slide 7 here. If I was selling an apple slicer and somebody searched for the word purple apple slicer, that would be maybe a really good case for us to use the word purple apple slicer as a negative, because if somebody's looking there specifically for a purple one, mine is not purple, I'd expect to have a poor conversion rate on that, and so I could set that as a negative keyword on it. So the negatives essentially are like just used to offset or to use against the keywords. So I think the example there is a really simple example of that. We see much more in real life. We see all kinds of things in here. Lots of good reasons to set negatives.
Yeah. So quick question, Proctor Paul. You do not pay. No, you do not pay to use negatives. Negatives are basically telling Amazon that if that term exists, you don't want to bid on the term. So you're not actually paying to be part of negative. Let's see here. So what's the next campaign after auto? So that's going to get a little bit into campaign structure, and that's where it's going to kind of be one of these it depends. I think the easiest way to look at it is that auto is your widest of the funnel, and exact is your smallest of the funnel. And if you move through, it goes auto, broad, phrase, exact.
Exactly.
And it's possible to move your keywords through. But if you have a winner, if you have a keyword that's really performing well on auto, you can move it straight to exact. So I think what makes sponsored ads a little bit challenging is that there is no step 1, step 2, step 3. There's a lot of kind of look at the data, analyze it, and make decisions.
Yeah, you do have to actually know how a lot of this stuff works in order to use this very effectively at all. So going back to negative keywords, like they just kind of are used as a negative match against it, right? So the apple slicer we have example there is a really simple one. We see stuff all the time, stuff like brand names, perhaps. If I'm selling my own brand apple slicer, and somebody else is selling like a name brand one, like a Pampered Chef or something. If somebody searches for Pampered Chef apple slicer, mine, I would expect to have maybe lower performance on that one. And so a lot of times that's the case for setting it as a negative.
So Brandon, I have a question that's come up here. I know the answer, but I'm going to ask you anyway. You're showing the negative exact with quotes around it. Are the quotes necessary within Amazon's system?
No, they're definitely not. So I'm just using that for presentation here. So
Right.
Amazon doesn't obey anything with quotes or apostrophes or any funky characters. It's basically only numbers and letters.
Right. So Hugh, there's a few of you talking in the comments about if for exact words you would put in quote unquote apple slicer. Understand that you're creating a term apple slicer and you're making it an exact campaign.
Yeah. Those guys might come from the Google world where that is a thing. And inside Google AdSense or AdWords, putting it inside quotes is kind of Google's way of saying a phrase match.
Right. So you don't actually, you define it as a phrase, a broad, or an exact match inside your campaign. That's an actual setting when you're selecting the term.
Yeah, that's a really good distinction to make, because if you do come from the Google world, where I know a lot of people come from advertising on their own websites, like Google has different syntax that kind of mean the same thing, and that's the quotes around it inside Google mean to use it as a phrase match. It has to match those two words together exactly. So the quotes in our examples are just to make it kind of more specific.
Just an example.
Yeah, just an example in ours. So inside Amazon, there's no such thing as quotes in any of the sponsored product things.
Yeah. So let's see. Are there any more questions about negative keywords? Otherwise, I think, Brandon, you were going to go into a couple of more things here, right?
Yeah, so I was going to dig into a lot more reasons why we would use negative keywords. But I'm looking back through comments to see if there's anything here. Sorry, a lot of these, we're kind of like trying to read through these really quickly, so I'm trying to see if there's anything.
Yeah, you guys have put up 378 comments so far, so we're trying to make sure we get to your answers and giving you guys the information. And I know this is a live broadcast, so think of it like when two amazing broadcasters are talking to each other. That's just like Brandon and I.
Yep. So I've seen this question actually from Gary that just came up a couple times. It says, why use negative? Why not remove it? Right. So what I've done in this case is, like, if we have and this goes back to the very subtle distinction between a keyword and a user search term, right? So if I have the keyword that I was defined as a broad match for apple slicer, that still is matching anything that has the word apple and slicer in it. And so I can't remove it because it's the negative keyword is the way of getting it out of there, right? I haven't bid on purple apple slicer specifically. I've only bid or created a keyword for broad apple slicer, which has, in some cases, thousands or a few thousand actual user search terms in it. So I can't like turn off purple apple slicer because I didn't actually create a bid for that one. It's just embedded in the broad term and all the other things that come along with that. And that's why negative keywords are so useful in those cases. I hope that helps with, who was that again? Gary, I think, asked that question.
Yeah, so I think that kind of covers, why are keywords important and how that's kind of all connected. A couple people are asking about access to Seller Labs PPC management tool called Ignite. I just put the link into the system. It's sellerlabs.com/ignite. That'll get you access to our PPC management system, which automates a lot of these processes. We're not really kind of selling the software right now. We're just really trying to kind of educate the community on sponsored ads. And, we're definitely going to be doing more and more as we move forward, where we'll get into showing you how the software actually works. But as you guys can tell, and as we've gotten really good feedback from the community, there's a lot of information to start understanding about how sponsored ads work. And I think April 4th, we're going to be doing a webinar where we're going to be showing all of this in conjunction with the software. And so you guys will get updates on that as well. So Mike, you get a t-shirt for best comment.
Purple apples. I was going to say that. Great.
Yeah. Mike wants to know who eats purple apples. So Mike, you get a t-shirt. So go ahead and private message me with your information and we'll get you a t-shirt. Yeah. And we always give away t-shirts for great comments. So if you come on here and you're creative and you ask good questions and you stay involved with us, then we can do that. So Miltos is asking for access to our software. We're on a waiting list right now because we're trying to make sure that we put enough people on it at a pace that our team can keep up with it. So the waiting list is not, you're not going to wait weeks. but we are making sure that we provide a very positive customer experience. So the faster you sign up, the faster you'll get your invitation. So if you are interested in trying the software, it does come with a 30-day free trial. You can jump on to sellerlabs.com/ignite and sign up for our waiting list. And as soon as your turn comes up, we will invite you. And so we thank you. We thank you for that. All right. So, all right, we gave away our free t-shirt for the best comment to Mike. We're about to go over 400 comments in total. And we've got a couple more things to kind of go through. And then we're going to give away 6 months free of the software. Sound good to you, Brandon?
That sounds great. We're really excited for it. So great to have Ignite start. Like I said, we're starting to get people on there. So people are finding it, I think, really useful, and we're just adding more of this educational content around it that helps to make it even more useful for people to use it.
Awesome. So why don't you dive back into our slides? I think we're on slide 9 or 10, and we're going to give a couple of examples here of how negative keywords work, and then there were a couple of other questions that kind of came up that I wanted to go back and make sure we answered. Okay,
so I want to breeze through these next few. This is just talking about a little bit more. This does touch on campaign organization, which I think a lot of people. There's a lot of ways to organize campaigns, and we're specifically telling people to do a specific reason, a specific way, and this is the reason why. So if you go to slide 9, I showed this is a product, or this apple slicer we're potentially running. I've got, in this example, the keyword apple slicer, I've got a keyword set up for that as a broad match, and I'm bidding, in this example, 28 cents on it. If you go to the next slide, you'll actually be able to see this is an export out of Ignite, but it shows like this particular broad match that we're on, and it shows the keyword apple slicer is the most frequently searched term. I've gotten the most impressions, the most clicks around that. But you can see the column over at the right, it's got the highest ACOS, right? It's got, in this example, a 44% ACOS, where the other keywords below it, I've got some that are in the 4, 9, 8% range, 12% range. Those are really good. But what I'd like to do in this particular example is to bid a lower amount on apple slicer while still keeping my 28-cent bid on everything else. Does that make sense so far, Jeff?
Yep.
Does everybody?
It does to me. I mean, Veronica says she's drinking from a fire hose right now.
Well, that's why these are recorded, so you go back and watch them again too. So,
and in all honesty, Veronica, that's why we're really trying to slow down and take this kind of step by step from an education perspective. Because if we actually took you, we started last week with terminology. We're going into kind of how the different campaigns and negative keywords work. And then next week, we're going to go into campaign structure. So Proctor, I'm going to answer to your question, which is, what does ACOS stand for? It's your advertising cost of sale. And if you look back at our other live broadcast, we actually go through all of the definitions where we go through all the definitions of all the things you see on the screen. And if you're starting on sponsored product ads, it's really important that you understand what all these definitions are. So I don't mind explaining them. Don't feel bad. I don't mind explaining them. I just wanted to make sure that you know that we've covered all those in detail in both a blog post and a live video. And I do agree that, it's much more fun for us to do these live. Brandon and I actually hung up last week, and we were talking about how much more fun this was than doing like a webinar, because we actually get to interact with you guys. We get to understand if what we're saying makes sense, and that's really important to us. So
the way we do these is we actually, obviously we're reading comments in real time here, and we actually go back afterwards a day later and try and people comment on it after the fact as well. So we try to go back and address those after the fact as well. So
yeah, and we also have
watching live. Feel free to comment. We'll try to reply back to that in the next day or two.
We also have a blog post that covers this as well, and we'll actually include these slides into that blog post, so you'll be able to access this information from different places.
Exactly. So cool. We'll go back to the slides there. You can see what I would intend to do on this, and I think hopefully this slide makes it kind of clear. If I've got this keyword, the broad match term, apple slicer, and the user search term inside there, apple slicer is a great term and has a lot of clicks, but it's costing me quite a bit. So I actually want to turn down my bid on that, right? So my cost per click is 20 cents on this, it says. So what I'd like to do is dial that down, right? So instead of bidding 20 cents on it, I'd like to bid maybe 15 cents on it or something. And so the next slide number 11, is kind of like how most people would approach that, right? So if I've got my ad group, I'd still keep my broad match for Apple Slicer, because all those other keywords in there, or all those other user search terms in there, are working pretty well. I'm getting a really good performance on most of those. And so what most people would try to do is create an exact match term for the keyword Apple Slicer and just bid on it at a lower dollar amount, right? Is that what you would do, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean that's the whole point. Is you want to lower your cost for the terms that you get. The higher conversion you get, the cheaper that conversion should be, because Amazon, they want to make money from the ad and from the sale.
Yep. So if presuming I wanted to bid less on that term, the exact term Apple Slicer, instead, if I created the exact term Apple Slicer inside here, most people would think I'm going to bid 14 cents on Apple Slicer, but in reality, what Amazon actually sees is that if somebody comes to this and somebody searches for Apple Slicer, I'm still going to get impressions and hits and clicks against my broad term Apple Slicer for that word, because it's the broad term Apple Slicer also matches the search term Apple Slicer. So that's kind of a very fine distinction, that even though I've created a more specific keyword for that specific term Apple Slicer, Amazon will still bid on it at the higher level, at the 28-cent level, because the user search term Apple Slicer applies to both of those keywords that I've specified. And
so Brandon, how do you decide how much to start bidding? I mean, Amazon does give you some suggestions, but when you're setting your default bid, how do you kind of decide what that should be?
I would probably suggest, if you don't know anything about where to start, 50 cents is a good number right now. $1 if you want to be more aggressive. And then I would just watch your impressions and see, if I'm not getting any impressions, you might want to turn it up a little bit.
Yeah, and so that goes back to the competitive. That goes back to the competitiveness of your product, right? So highly competitive products will require you to bid more. So David just pointed out that today is Pi Day, and so should we give away some Apple Slicers?
I think we can figure out a way to do that. I don't know. We don't have them in the office, but we'll figure out how to get them to you. Sure.
All right, we're gonna give away some Apple. We're gonna give away some Apple Slicers. So comment number 314 is gonna get an Apple Slicer.
Excellent. That's pi for those of you that are mathematically unaware. 3.14.
Yes. And should we do comment 31 and 14?
There you go. That's another way of doing it too.
All right. And
Matthew really knows his pi there, doesn't he?
All right, so we're going to give away 3 Apple Slicers. So if we'll go through and we'll let you know if you won the Apple Slicer. We should have known that it was Pi Day. I mean, I did know that. I saw it earlier today, but I wish I had thought of it. That would have been.
I brought pie here in the office, so I had a piece of pumpkin pie actually, but it was still good.
Yeah. So Jason is saying, let's see, the comments are flying in here pretty quickly. If Amazon gives a suggested bid of $1.66 and I bid $3, will Amazon charge me $1.66 or whatever the next higher increment is?
Yeah, so this goes back down to bids again. I think we talked about this briefly in our last one, but Amazon's only going to charge you a penny over what the next person below you bid. If that makes any sense, right? So in this term, presume we've got 10 or 20 sellers all bidding on the term Apple Slicer, and they've all got various bids. Like if my bid's 28 cents and somebody else is bidding 30 cents and somebody else is bidding $1, I'm going to get shown at 28 cents. The person above me who bid 30 cents is actually going to get charged 29 cents if somebody clicks on it. And the person that bids $1 is only going to get charged 31 cents because that's a penny over the person below them. So even if you bid really high, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get charged that much. So it's one of those things that it's a little bit.
Does that make sense to everybody?
If you think of it as an auction, that's how it really works, and it's all just very real time.
Yeah. Yeah. And so Amazon's goal is not to necessarily gouge you and charge you the full price that you're bidding, but in all honesty, if your ad performs better and your bid is lower, you still might win. So they don't just give it to the person that has the highest bid.
That's true. They take a lot of different things into effect. I think obviously the bid on it is one of the major ones, but they also take into effect like into consideration your conversion rate, and Amazon wants people to actually ultimately buy stuff once they click on it, so they take that into account. It's more complicated than just the bid, although the bid is a pretty significant indicator. So
awesome. Give me a second here. I'm going to start figuring out who our winner is for our software. All right. You want to wrap up the last couple slides there, Brandon? Do you want to wrap up the last couple of slides?
Yeah, let's finish up. I'm taking some notes here about future content as well. So thanks for all the suggestions coming in. So going back to the slide 12, what we kind of put in there is apple slicer with a broad term and apple slicer with an exact term. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to bid lower on the exact term, because the exact term still matches up to the broad term. So that doesn't work like you kind of expect. So our suggested way of doing that is to use two separate ad groups, and this is where negative keywords really come into play. So I'd create one ad group for broad match terms and one ad group for exact match terms, and then I'd bid on apple slicer with the exact match term inside my exact campaign, and I'd use apple slicer as a negative term inside my broad match campaign, so that I don't bid on it over there in the more expensive campaign. So just I'm trying to run that down and make sure we're super clear about this. So again, back into my broad match campaign where I'm bidding 28 cents on it, I still want to bid 28 cents on it because I've got all those other terms that are in there that are all working very well for me. And I don't want to just turn off the broad match apple slicer because it's working so well. It's just the one term inside of there that the exact match term apple slicer is more expensive than I'd like. So in order to bid on that at a lower dollar amount, I create it in a separate ad group. We call it exact in this case, and I can bid on whatever I want there. And then back in the broad match campaign, I need to create a negative exact keyword there so that it doesn't bid on it at that amount. And that's how you accomplish bidding on something at a lower dollar amount if it's not performing as well. So that's the negative keywords, ad groups, trying to pull all this back together into something that's useful. This is the reason why a lot of those exist, is so that you can get that better granularity. And another great reason to use manual campaigns instead of automatic is because you do get the ability to do this at a very granular level. But like I said, it does take a fair amount of knowledge on how to set up stuff and structure this kind of thing.
Awesome.
Does that make sense, Jeff, how we explained that on slide 13?
Yeah, I mean, listen, this is that conversation that you and I had, and we had this conversation with somebody yesterday. Like, it makes sense to us, and what we want to make sure. Oh, do you guys like Brandon's cup? He drinks out of a small cup.
This is my big mug.
We know that it makes sense to us. What we want to know is, does it make sense to you? So that's what we're really trying to, to understand is this all making sense to you, and what's not making sense? So Cheryl says, is the auction only based on the highest amount, or are there other factors? So I think we kind of covered that, Cheryl. It's definitely based on other factors. Amazon wants to know.
Yeah, I'm going to try to put together an actual blog post or something about that, Jeff, so we can iron the language out about that more specifically, give some more concrete examples.
Yeah. So Brian Brown wants to know, do you typically spend more on exact keywords than you do on broad? Not necessarily. It probably depends on whether you have the keyword listed in both.
It depends on how competitive it is, right? So if apple slicers are extremely competitive, and I would expect the broad match or the user search term apple slicer to be really expensive, right? And if I'm selling a red apple slicer and I can get a better conversion rate for that and it costs me less, I might actually want to bid more on the red apple slicer term, even though it's not as frequently searched, right? So I might want to. There's different ways to do it, but the key is, one of the other things we're trying to do with this too is teach a little bit how to structure campaigns, because if you don't sort of, and I guess the takeaway from this particular slide is that we're trying to encourage user, and our software makes it so that we automatically create 3 ad groups for broad, phrase, and exact match. And we suggest that people do that for this reason, because it makes it possible. And if you don't do that when you're starting out, it's a little bit more complicated to try and like take an existing campaign and put it back into these suggestions. So if you're just starting out and you haven't created a campaign yet, we would suggest you create ad groups inside there for broad, phrase, and exact match, so that we can do this more advanced.
We're cutting out a little bit. I don't know if it's you or if it's me.
It might have been. I think I'm fine, but I don't know. Anyway, the takeaway from this, hopefully, is to create 3 different ad groups, one for broad, phrase, and exact match, and that opens up possibilities in the future for you. And if we find a lot of people that are starting to use Ignite, and they've got sort of a conglomeration and hadn't really had a strategy prior to that, and it's a little bit more difficult to set up a campaign with that because we have to like move stuff around. So if we have this structure to begin with, it just simplifies a lot of things. Once you get more education and knowledge and learn more about this, you'll appreciate this more. Hopefully that makes sense, and you're still with me, Jeff.
Yeah. So I'm actually being told that it's me. It's not you.
All right, good. That's what I figured. But you're hosting this, so hopefully it still works all right.
I guess. So Mike wants to know, and this is a good question for us to kind of. And I think, Mike, there are two answers to that. I put up 2. That's 4, but there's 2 answers to that. One, and that's kind of the reason why you run an auto-targeted campaign is to find the keywords. Use your data or your competitors' data to bypass the auto-targeted campaigns, and when you do that, you typically and save yourself time. And I don't mean to kind of throw that out as a tease. We do have a video on scope on in depth to kind of show how all of that works, and we're definitely 100% going to show you that. And if you use Ignite, it actually integrated into it, which allows you to pull that data right in.
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit there, Jeff. So I just want to rephrase a little bit, but what you're talking about basically is a lot of times we can shortcut an automatic campaign. We see people typically spend $100, $300, $500 sometimes on an automatic campaign, and it takes 30 days, sometimes 2 months or something to get to it. If you've seen our product about Scope, we don't want to promote ourselves too much, but Scope's pretty awesome because you can use it to get a lot of good keyword data really quickly, and a lot of times bypass that 30 to 60 days and several $100s. And just we can still use automatic targeted campaigns because they still continue to find new stuff for us that maybe we don't know about yet. But a lot of times we can bypass that and just start right off with broad match or something when we're creating a new campaign. That's a good way of leading into our software, which is going to help make that all a lot easier.
Yeah, I'm getting really bad internet here, so I'm going to keep my video off and let you kind of finish the talking. And then we can wrap it up. So I'm going to go ahead and give away the free scope. The scope 6 months is going to go to comment number 373. So we'll go ahead and figure out who that is afterwards. So we gave away 3 shirts. We gave away 3 apple slicers for Pi Day, and 6 months of 6 months of our tool. So if you want to, I'll go ahead and put some links in here for you. And Brandon, I'll let you kind of wrap it up.
Great. So the last slide I have on here, this is just kind of talking about recapping a little bit what we talked about, but generally start off in automatic campaigns or broad campaigns. And as you get more history about stuff, you gain more knowledge. You get more knowledge about what your conversion rate are, what your performance is for each one of these search terms. And we tend to see people getting more specific, right? So if once I've accumulated some data and I know how a particular variation or a particular user search term performs, it's very, very common for us to see people move it something from a broad match and then taking some of the things that are out of there that are really effective or not effective, just if I've got more history about it, moving up from broad right over to exact or to phrase match to be able to bid on that at a little bit finer resolution. And that's a really good dial to be able to get more specific and really tune in your advertising costs, especially as all this gets more competitive. It's going to be more important to be more dialed in there. And so the more data you can sort of accumulate, we're just trying to use that data effectively. And that's typically how we see people do it, is moving keywords, creating more exact match keywords the longer they have a campaign. And we got more history to do those.
Awesome. Well, let's just wrap it up and say thank you and call it a day.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Like I said, we're going to be reviewing these comments and go back through them and try to reply to some of them that we haven't talked about. Again, our next webinar, we're going to do it next Tuesday again, Jeff, Tuesday at 2?
I'll be at Prosper, but we can try to make it happen.
That's going to be challenging. Let's not promise that yet, because I think we're both going to be there. I actually might be traveling that day. I'm not sure.
Yeah, you might be on a plane.
Yeah, so let's not make a promise there. Let's figure out. We'll figure out how to post that back in the user group then.
Yeah. So next week I will be going live from Prosper for people that want to. I'm going to be doing some live conversations from people at the Prosper show. So.
Yeah, certainly. If you're at Prosper, come find us. We'd be happy to talk to you and talk about some of this stuff specifically. It'd be great.
Is anybody going to? If you're going to Prosper, comment Prosper in the comments so we can see that you're coming. We'd love to know.
Oh, I just lost my feed of comments. Put it back on.
Awesome. Well, we're gonna call it a quit there, and thank you all for coming on, and we will catch up with you guys soon. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.